I am your host, Dewa DeBoer, and joining me is Jared Taylor, who is an American author and the editor of the American Renaissance magazine and website. Welcome to the show, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became to be what you call a white advocate?
Yes, I have been standing up for white people, our race, since 1990. I've been doing it, as one of the young lads in our movement once said, even became cool. And I'm glad to know that it has now finally become cool because, as I'm sure you know, for white people to speak in their own interests has been considered a very nasty taboo for a long time. I used to be a liberal. In fact, I was an entirely conventional liberal until probably in my mid to late 30s. And I clung to my liberal illusions for a very long time. I had the idea that race could be made not to matter, that we would all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and live happily ever after. But those illusions foundered on the rocks of reality, and I started seeing the necessity for white people to really advocate for their own interests because every other race was doing that. And if we failed to do so, our interests would be ignored and even trampled. So it was a long story, but now I consider my work to be involved in two general areas. One is race realism. That's the recognition that race is a biological phenomenon. It's not some sort of sociological optical illusion or a social construct, as we are so foolishly advised to believe. It is a genuine biological division of human races, and that the different races are not interchangeable and identical. Wherever you find white people, they tend to build societies that have similar textures of life, a similar way of looking at things. The same for East Asians, the same for Sub-Saharan Africans. The idea that you could take a majority white nation and swap out its population, largely or wholly, and then replace it with people from another race, and that nation would continue more or less with its values and its texture of life unchanged, is folly. And so, on the one hand, yes, race realism is the recognition of the importance of race. And then white advocacy is the recognition that we as whites have interests, entirely legitimate interests. And just as other racial groups, certainly here in the United States and essentially all around the world, have organizations and publications and spokesmen that stand up for their interests, unless whites do the same, our interests, as I said before, will be ignored and shoved aside. So those are the two main areas of my work.
I remember the first time I came across your ideas and you saying something like this and being a bit shocked and taken aback. I think many people who hear that for the first time think that runs contrary to everything that I've been taught, and it sounds very strange. And like you said, well, why can't we all uh, be happy together? And many people say in New Zealand as well would look at say activists for particular racial groups, say the Maori in New Zealand, you're Maori nationalists, and a lot of people look at that and say, well, those people are really annoying. They're being divisive, they're causing division in society, and we want to have a united society, and we just want them to stop doing that. And if you are saying, well, we should do the same as them, is that not going to create more problems? Is that not going to create more division and strife?
Well, I can speak only for the situation in the United States. I don't know how large your Maori population is. I do know that there's a considerable amount of East Asian immigration into New Zealand.
As
And my
well.
suspicion is that if you just open up the borders to large-scale immigration, before long, white native New Zealanders would be outnumbered by people from other countries, primarily Asia, but perhaps from the Middle East, perhaps from Africa. I really don't know the details of life in New Zealand. But certainly in the United States, up until 1965, we had an immigration policy that was designed specifically to keep the United States majority white. And it worked very well. We had a nation that I think was extremely successful. At that time, of course, it was the height of its world power. That was a result of many things, one of which was the exhaustion of the rest of the world due to two world wars, the fact that we had suffered very lightly in those wars, relatively speaking. But we had a largely homogeneous nation, about 90% white. And there was a sense of all being in this together. But there was a change in our immigration policy, which abandoned the idea of keeping the United States white, just as Australia had a white Australia policy. The idea was to let in white immigrants to maintain a certain white homogeneity. In 1965, we decided that was just an awful thing, although the promise was that this new change in the law would not greatly disrupt the racial mix. I'm not sure that people who made those promises, in fact, believed them, but those promises turned out to be false. And so, as it turns out, by 2045 or so, and that's to say maybe 80 years after that law was passed, the United States will go from being 90% white to being minority white. And I can assure you that if a congressman of that time were told, well, if you pass this law, you will set certain forces in motion that will ensure that whites become not a minority, perhaps in the lives of your children or your grandchildren, they would have said, absolutely not. That would have been unthinkable. And since the founding of the United States, it was taken for granted that this was to be a nation of Europeans. This was to be an extension of Europe on the North American continent. And I don't know how well acquainted that your viewers and listeners are with American history with regard to race, but the very first naturalization law that was passed by the very first Congress after our Constitution was ratified in 1788, and the first Congress met in 1789, and it had to decide, well, what kind of country is this going to be, this brand new United States of America? And it was decided without any recorded opposition that naturalization was going to be available only to free white persons of good character. This was to be a white country. And so it was from 1790 up until 1965. This was official American policy. And I think there was absolutely nothing wrong with this policy. The American people were not consulted on the idea as to whether or not, well, do you as whites wish to become a minority? And so this was a terrible, terrible mistake. That law, which changed our immigration policy, I believe was the most destructive law ever passed in human history. Now, the United States has gone into this process of reducing whites to a minority in a way that's different from the process that we now see unfolding in certain countries in Europe. It's now expected that in Great Britain, that's the land of my ancestors and the land of the ancestors of many New Zealanders. Now, Great Britain is expected to have white Brits become a minority by about 2060. Why? Why? In whose interest is this? And when we see other countries around the world, non-white countries, we would never assume that it is somehow required of them morally to let strangers into their country in such numbers that the native populations will become minorities. Take the Japanese, the Chinese, or the Turks, or anyone at all, the Indonesians, the Vietnamese. If you were to propose to them, well, look, there are people around the world who would like to come live with you, and they're not like you. They have different religions. They're racially different, but it's your moral obligation to let them in. Let them in such numbers that you may become minorities. Yes, but that's just the way the world works. That's what morality requires. They'd call for the men in the white coats. They'd lock you up in a rubber room. This would be preposterous to them. But in the United States and in Europe, if you were to say, well, France should be for Frenchmen, isn't that obvious? This was a country that was built by their ancestors for them. Why are the French under any obligation to let in Muslims and Africans and Asians who are not French, and many of whom have no desire to be French? What is the purpose of this? Why should this be an obligation forced upon them? There's no good answer to that question, but it is considered immoral even to raise it. Again, I don't know what the forces are at work in New Zealand, but I have heard that Maoris are becoming increasingly demanding. I believe isn't there a movement on now to change the name of New Zealand to some unpronounceable term I never can remember with about 7 or 8 syllables. But this is proof, in my view, that multiracialism is a difficult, and perhaps impossible undertaking. The idea of the United States, ever since the 1960s on, was to build a nation in which race can be made not to matter. I believe that is impossible. Race and a sense of racial loyalty, a sense of tribal difference is built into us. We have evolved for this to be true. And at the same time, as I said earlier, people of different races, although there's a very considerable overlap, are not identical in terms of their abilities, in terms of their inclination to create what we would consider a desirable civilization. And so when the population of a country changes many things, you might even argue that everything changes. And it is perfectly legitimate for white Americans not to want to undergo those changes. And if the same threats meet New Zealanders, then I would argue the same way, that it's perfectly legitimate for white New Zealanders not to wish to change in any substantial way the nation that their ancestors built on those islands.
Do you believe that since you started, your work has become easier? Um, or have other changes taken place? Because I guess when you started, America in particular, and most of the nations you mentioned that, say England, it would have been considered absurd to say, well, England is going to, English people are going to become a minority in England, Americans are going to become a minority in America. Say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you would have been considered strange, and yet now it's published in mainstream newspapers. People are talking about it. Is it that people are seeing the effects of these policies that your views are becoming more received, or do you see more hostility instead?
Both, really. The hostility has not diminished from certain circles, even though the fact of what the French philosopher Renaud Camus called the Great Replacement. This is the great replacement of white populations in traditionally white societies. The Great Replacement is obviously happening. And yet, if you look at the Wikipedia page that discusses the Great Replacement, it will say that this is a white supremacist conspiracy theory. It's not really happening. Or if you actually show the statistics that it is happening in a very substantial and rapid way, then it's a good thing. It's considered a good thing. Well, it's okay if French become a minority or if American whites become a minority. This is, again, a complete double standard because these very same people would never say that the Japanese, they're not having as many babies as they should. Well, let's replace them with Turks, Filipinos, Indonesians. Why not? No, they understand that the Japanese have a right to remain Japanese. It's somehow only European whites, wherever they are, who somehow it is an act of intense immorality to wish to preserve their own societies. Now, there are enough people who, like me, see these changes and who are perfectly assured from any kind of historical or moral point of view that resisting these changes is absolutely correct. It's natural, normal, and healthy. And so I believe I have seen a tremendous amount of progress in the last 35 years since I started American Renaissance in people willing to stand up and say, this is unacceptable and we deserve homelands in which we are the eternal majority. So the hostility has not diminished, but hostility has increased, if for any other reason, because there are so many people who are making my arguments. When I first started out, it was a very lonely thing. There are very few people who were getting up in public and saying the kinds of things that I'm saying. Now there are dozens. I just can't keep track of them all, thousands perhaps. If you go on X, gosh, there's almost a kind of unanimity that this is a legitimate position for white people to take anywhere, that we have the right to be majorities, just as other groups have the right to be majorities in their lands. So there is tremendous progress. In Europe, there is a lot of progress towards the idea of what's called remigration. That is to say, these non-Europeans have entered Europe from all around the world. Well, they can then go back in a process that is known as remigration. And this is justified because Europeans never voted or agreed to be displaced by large numbers of aliens. This is an immoral thing, and it is the most natural, normal, and healthy thing for white people to wish to remain majorities in their own countries. So yes, there is enormous progress in the last 35 years, and I've never been more optimistic about the prospects of reaching some kind of mutually agreeable solution.
I mean, you've already mentioned France and the term remigration. I believe you have some history there as well in France, that you speak French as well, and you mentioned Japan as well. You speak Japanese too. Has
Yes.
your Did you, did your the time you spent there in those countries learning those languages, experiencing those cultures, uh, shape your views in any way? Is there a background here, or were you at that time very, very liberal?
I grew up in Japan. I lived in Japan until I was 16 years old. And at that time, I just absorbed the ambient liberalism of my upbringing. My parents were Presbyterian missionaries, and they had absolutely no sense of racial consciousness. And that was the worldview that I absorbed. As for when I was living in France, that was sometime later. That was, let's see, from about 1974 to 1976. I was a university student there, and the illusions of liberalism were beginning to crumble. But learning French was not so much important as spending time in French West Africa. I vagabonded around such places as uh, Senegal, Ivory Coast. At the time, it was known as Upper Volta, Niger, and that was a very eye-opening experience. At the time, I did not have a really complete understanding. Well, I still don't have a complete understanding. Probably no one does, but I didn't have a mature understanding of race and racial differences. But I was struck at how different Black Africans were from other people that I knew, certainly different from Europeans. So all of this was a gradual process whereby I came to realize that these illusions on which I had been reared were perhaps pleasant, but they were not a realistic way of viewing the world. And for so long as white people insisted on maintaining these illusions and insisting that it was immoral for them to defend their own interests as white people, then we faced a terrible future, ultimately, in the long term, displacement from our own homelands and perhaps even extinction. So, living in Africa did open my eyes to a certain number of things, but at the time I was so convinced of my liberalism that it was not a full awakening.
I was in France, specifically Paris, about 10 years ago, and I remember growing up. Reading, seeing how Paris in particular was presented in such a romantic way, and then actually turning up there 10 years ago, I was just struck by how filthy and dirty it was, and how it was not that romantic. Like that had just completely disappeared in the space of however many years, since people had built up these romantic feelings of Paris. But the people obviously who were living there seemed like they didn't notice it very much. And being part of this process where things degrade over time, it's less obvious than if you're someone who comes in from the outside with a preconceived notion of how it should be. Suddenly you realize that, hey, things have gone very wrong here.
That's true. If you are living through a gradual process, then you don't see the progress of degradation quite as sharply as someone who shows up perhaps 10 years later, 20 years later, or comes up on a scene fresh. But this is what happens in any European capital when enough third worlders show up. Third worlders, like it or not, bring the third world with them. And you get the kind of dirtiness you described. You get a kind of public misbehavior that you don't encounter with native-born white people. Graffiti and criminality, all of these things always come in the train of large-scale third world immigration. This is something that seems so obvious once you open your eyes and see it for yourself. You see it in London, you see it in Berlin, you see it in Brussels. All of these once beautiful, peaceful capitals, now with enough non-whites from various places around the world, the texture of life changes, the visual landscape changes, and it changes in ways that are clearly disagreeable. And what happens is what happens in the United States when non-whites move into white areas. Life becomes disagreeable, and many of the whites leave. But for the most part, they don't dare say, well, this is because of a racial change. They will talk about, oh, there was an increase in crime, or there was more pollution, or there was just kind of a dark environment. Things were different. They don't seem to realize that this is something that happens when a new population moves in. Now, as I said before, more and more white people are beginning not only to see the obvious, but publicly to state the obvious and to say, if we care about our civilization, if we care about the future of our children, then we must stop this process. We must stop these people who are aliens, unlike ourselves, from moving into our lands, our once beautiful capital cities. We must stop this process and, to the extent possible, encourage them, or if they're there illegally, force them to return to their own homelands. This is the only way that our nations can be preserved as European, and the only way that they will have a future that is worthy, I believe, of our descendants.
I believe you attended the Remigration Summit in Milan,
Yes,
in that was hosted by Martin Sellner, who I've interviewed before. What were your impressions of that summit, of meeting these European activists who, I believe many of them very, very young, doing
yes.
sort of the work that you perhaps inspired in some way, or what do you see as the future of Europe
Oh,
with those young people?
I am wonderfully inspired by the work of these young people. When I first started doing this kind of work, if I would address a group in the United States, they were not very impressive people. They were cranks. They were oddballs. In order to have a dissonant view about race, you had to be strange. Now, the people who are talking about remigration and the necessity of saving Western civilization, these are smart, nice looking, well educated, motivated, really great, impressive people. This has been a tremendous, tremendous change. And so when I see the work of people like Martin Salter and Sellner or Dries van Langenhove, or the people at Chega, or people from Ireland who are talking about the necessity of saving their race, their nation, their civilization, I'm very, very encouraged. And I think that we are definitely making progress. As I said before, it's still in the teeth of intense opposition by people who have yet to be convinced that it is moral for white people to want to survive. Once you have taken the view that we have, then it becomes increasingly difficult to understand the motives of those who say that, well, no, no, we should let all these people in and happily become a minority and joyfully march off the stage of history. I find those people increasingly difficult to understand. But if we are to succeed, we must persuade more and more of them that we are right and they are wrong. And this process that has led to the Remigration Summit, the organizations, the people, those who are involved in this great effort are to me a sign of enormous progress and are a source of enormous optimism and good cheer for me.
And do you see any big weaknesses in the movement as well? As you've talked about the growth in this movement, are there risks, are there dangers ahead that you think things could go wrong as well, either in
Oh,
Europe or in
things
America?
things can always go wrong. And there's always a certain amount of division. There's always a certain amount of jockeying for position. But I believe that what I see now is a kind of maturation of these things. Perhaps 10 years ago, those who were speaking about the important rights of white people, I think there was at that time more backbiting, more jockeying for position. I think there's less of that now. There's more of a sense that we're absolutely in this together. We have to work across borders. Now, the dangers, of course, are that there is still a penalty to be paid for those who have jobs in some kind of respectable big organization. If it turns out that it becomes known that they attended the Remigration Summit, or if they were supporting an organization of this kind, they might be fired. Some people might lose their girlfriends. Some of their family members might get upset. All of this is a consequence of the years and years and years of propaganda that they have had from the mainstream media, from the churches, and the universities, trying to convince them that anyone who is motivated in the defense of Europe is somehow motivated by hate. This was really a brilliant, brilliant decision by those who oppose what I'm doing to say somehow that, no, 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 you don't even need to listen to these people because all they are motivated by is hate for people who are unlike themselves. Well, that's of course not true at all. If I were in the business of hating anybody, I suppose I would be hating the white people who still run these countries, who are opening up the floodgates to the people who want to come. I don't at all blame Hispanics, Mexicans, or Guatemalans, or Somalis, or Haitians. I don't blame them if they want to come to the United States. They can live so much better. And here in the United States, once they get here, they benefit from racial preferences. It must just be the most astonishing experience for them to realize that because they are here, legally or not, they benefit from preferences if they're applying for universities, or at least up until very recently they did, or if they're applying for jobs. It's as if we fall down before them and kiss their feet for bringing us this wonderful diversity of which we lacked back in the 1950s and 60s before we opened up the borders of the United States to all of these wonderful people. Those who come and see this happening, as I say, must think, well, maybe tomorrow it's going to rain beer. This is a marvelous country. So I don't blame them at all. I blame our rulers, our governments, who are unwilling to put the interests of the people who built this country and their descendants first, which is the most obvious and, it seems to me, essential thing that a government should do. A government's job, first of all, is to protect the interests of that nation. And that nation is composed of the people who built that nation, not strangers from everywhere in the world. One of the remarkable things about Donald Trump is that he wanted to put America first. Well, this was considered some kind of outrageous act of selfishness. But isn't that every government's job? Shouldn't the government of Japan, shouldn't its job be to put Japan first? But for somehow the United States to do that is some kind of outrage. But in any case, yes, I'm greatly encouraged, and there is still a price to pay, certainly for those who are not in a position to be known publicly. Now, I've been out of the closet, so to speak, for 35 years, so it's not a real problem for me, but there's still many people who cannot afford to be publicly associated with white advocacy. Excuse me.
Now, you already referred to the mainstream media, and I suspect you spend a lot of your time defending yourself against attacks from the mainstream media, the descriptions of you that they give. In fact, I think if anybody were to search your name, they would find all manner of articles and accusations and labels that are applied to you. Uh, why do they do this, and how much of it is true, and how?
Well, excuse me again. Well, my Wikipedia article, the very first sentence says that I am a white supremacist. This is just presented as absolute indisputable fact. While I've never considered myself a white supremacist, I've never met anyone that I would call a white supremacist. To me, a white supremacist is someone who wants to rule over people of other races. And that is a historical term. Yes, the British and the French and Spanish, who established their colonial empires, they did wish to rule over people of other races. They had various economic interests, but at the same time, they believed that they were bringing civilization, they were bringing Christianity, salvation to people of different races. And if you look at the British Empire, for example, with any kind of objectivity, you can see that, well, yes, in some respects, it certainly benefited the metropolitan country, but it brought tremendous benefits to the colonized countries. This is not the place to go into that in any detail, but the idea of bringing these less well-instructed peoples under the tutelage of whites and helping them move forward. Yes, you could call that white supremacist, but as I say, I don't know anyone who has that desire today. The people that are in my circle, they want to be left alone. They're white people who want to have societies that reflect their values, where their children and grandchildren can grow up among those values forever. And at the same time, this implies no hostility to other groups at all. I want Black people to be the best possible Black people they can be. And I don't think that it's good for Black people to be living among whites and constantly telling themselves that all of their failures are due to the wickedness and evil intentions of people who look like me. What a way to live. But that is what American society essentially tells Black people. No, I believe Black people should live in a society in which they know that they can rise and fall according to their own exertions and their own abilities. A society in which, if they are arrested for a crime, then they will be handled and tried by people who are like them. I think that white society has bent over backwards to a remarkable degree to be fair, even more than fair, to Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, any other racial minorities. But you cannot convince Black people of this. However, if they really were in a society in which they were responsible for schools, for courts, for every institution, for government, then they would have no excuses. They would know that their society reflected them. It was not something that was constrained by this constant miasma of white supremacy or systemic racism or all of these voodoo-like views that so many Blacks and white liberals have about American society. There's somehow there's an atmosphere of even unconscious bias in America that makes Blacks and Hispanics in particular to fail. All of that would be gone if they had their own place. And as far as I'm concerned, let them build Wakanda. I want Blacks or Hispanics, any other group, to build the best possible society that they can. All I want for white people is to be left alone. And also, when people call me a white supremacist, I've drifted some ways away from this idea that the way that I'm portrayed in the media. Some people would argue that a white supremacist is someone who believes that white people are superior to people of other races. I don't think that white people are superior. I don't think races are in general superior. Races can be different. And if you wanted to talk about superiority or inferiority, East Asians, Japanese, Koreans, Taiwanese, Northern Chinese, Han Chinese, I think it's accurate to argue that probably on average they have higher IQs than Europeans. They have lower crime rates, lower illegitimacy rates, and not just in their own countries, but here when they mix in the United States. You could argue, if you wished, that they are objectively superior to Europeans. So even if that is the definition of white supremacy, then you'd have to call me a yellow supremacist. This does not mean that I want to be replaced by Asians. I like my people. I like the way they behave. I like the way they look. I like the kind of Faustian approach they've had in history to doing great things. They are my people. They are my extended family. I don't want to be replaced by people, even if they are vastly superior. Just as I think probably the people of New Guinea, for heaven's sake, you might say that East Asians are superior to them and to build superior civilizations. Does that mean that New Guineans should be replaced by them? Absolutely not. They have their own society, which they love, which they have the right to preserve. All I'm asking for white people is what I'm happy, delighted to ensure for every other group. Just let us be who we are without the unwanted interference and absorption of other people who are unlike us. It seems perfectly straightforward and obvious to me.
If I just circle back a little bit to the discussion that we had around Europeans becoming minorities in their own countries, and there seems to, there's a lot of discussion about Zimbabwe and South Africa, in particular. You mentioned so the black majorities there run those countries. They are in full control, but it has to be observed that say 30 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later, they still seem to put the blame on Europeans for their
Yes.
problems. And so, is that a very common concern that people in your movement have to say, well, if this happens to us, then we're just going we'll just be oppressed and we'll be blamed forever, and our descendants will continually be blamed for these problems, even though hypothetically we would no longer be in control.
Oh, I suspect that if the things continue as they are now, and white people in the United States are displaced, reduced to minority, even disappear, there are probably going to be a number of blacks who forever are going to say, oh, this is the legacy of Jim Crow. This is the legacy of racism. This is the legacy of slavery. That's why we're not as rich as the Canadians or the Mexicans or whoever it is. Yes, this is something that has been beaten mercilessly into the minds of black people. White liberals themselves have done this. And they don't seem to realize that when whites are constantly telling blacks that everything that's ever gone wrong for them is the fault of white people, either past or present. They're teaching black people to hate whites. I mean, how could you not help but hate white people if you really do believe that the fact that you're more likely to be criminals, that you're poorer, more likely to be on welfare, have illegitimate children, less likely to be successful in business or in academia, it's all the fault of those wicked white people. How can they help but hate white people? But this is something that they're going to have to work out for themselves. I'm sorry. Maybe you could argue that white people have put this into their minds, that it's all white people's fault, but maybe white people are going to have to start explaining to them, no, 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 it's not our fault. This is, you have risen within American society to the level that your capacities would justify your rising. And in some cases, even further because of racial preferences. Now, if you really want to be free from us, and many black people, especially the most successful ones, they're the ones who are complaining most vociferously about systemic racism and how they can't get through life without being insulted and belittled by white people. If that's the case, if being around us is so awful, well then please go your own way and let us go our own way. Well, I think deep in their hearts, most black people, even the ones who are most hostile towards us and who blame us for everything, deep in their hearts, they know that if blacks in the United States or anywhere else are really left to their own devices, what they'll end up with is what Haiti got after independence from France, what Zimbabwe turned into after they kicked out the British, what South Africa is turning into now that it's become independent and it's ruled by blacks. I think somewhere within their psyches, most blacks realize that they do not build the kind of successful societies that white people do. But this is not an illusion that we must permit to allow them to live forever amongst us, blaming us for things that are not our fault. I'm sorry. At some point, white people have to have the backbone to tell others, no, this is our country. Our ancestors built this for us. Now, we will help you to the extent that we can, but you must succeed under your own powers, according to your own abilities. And we wish you well, but you cannot forever stay with us. If race relations were likened to a marriage, I would say that we have irreconcilable differences. And according to contemporary thinking, even among liberals, when a man and a woman have a marriage in which there are irreconcilable differences, that is grounds for divorce. We have been, in that sense, married to black people and American Indians, for that matter, for even longer, ever since, the 1600s, in the case of the American Indians, even earlier. But we need a divorce. We need to go our separate ways. And this idea is taking hold. And it is a similar idea to the idea of remigration, which, as we discussed earlier, is taking hold among young Europeans. We simply cannot go on this way. Everything that we have built, Western civilization, in all of its glory and all of its beauty, cannot survive the great replacement. And so we must reverse it, or our civilization, and we will die.
Uh, would you describe your views as being in favor then of freedom of association? We often talk about freedom of association, the right to association. Does that exist, in your opinion, in America? And is that something that you believe would solve many problems if people could have greater voluntary association?
Well, there already is a certain amount of freedom of association, and that's why we have residential segregation in the United States. When white people are free to choose, take the case of churches. Churches in America have never been subject to the kind of forced integration that schools or workplaces have been subject to. And as Martin Luther King used to say 11 o'clock. That is 11 in the morning on Sunday. That's when church service usually begins. That's the most segregated hour in America. That is because people are free to choose their own church. Black people like to worship with black people, white people with white people, Koreans with Koreans. We have hundreds of Korean churches in the United States. Most people are unaware of this. Koreans, even if they've been in the United States for several generations, they prefer to worship among people like themselves. This is an expression of, I believe, just a basic part of human nature. And I think that it would be a great leap forward if, instead of constantly trying to force people together through these laws that require school integration or that forbid discrimination, in other words, forbid freedom of association, if the United States government got out of the business of forcing people together and said and took the position that it's perfectly okay for people to want to live in a society or community that is racially and culturally coherent. That would be a huge leap forward. That could be a step towards gradual voluntary separation into different regions of the United States. And I believe that that is the only way that European civilization in the long run will survive. It will survive in North America only if whites have areas in which they are the recognized majority, in which they can be involved in the unfolding of their own culture in their own way. So I think that is a very, very important first step, and it's not one that is inconceivable. Why is it? Why is it that schools had to be racially integrated? Why is it that neighborhoods had to be racially integrated? And when it comes to neighborhoods and schools, the United States government has pretty much given up. But still, the idea of no, you can't have a workforce that is all black, or, well, you actually can. Nobody's going to get upset if you do that. But if you have a workforce that's all white, oh, no, 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 that's a terrible thing. Yes, freedom of association is a profoundly important factor of liberty, of freedom in general. And it's something that most people don't think about. But what is called in the technical literature a refusal to deal. If I refuse to serve you in my restaurant, or if I refuse to be your friend, I have not harmed you in the sense that you are not worse off than you were before. It is my right not to deal with you if that's my preference. And people understand that perfectly when it comes to male-female relations. I may be tremendously attracted to some beautiful girl. She has every right to tell me to buzz off. She can tell me to buzz off for good reasons, bad reasons, no reasons at all. It's up to her. This is something that should be part of all of our relations in all ways. Now, the government does not have the right because it's a monopoly. The electric company can't say, well, we're going to sell electricity only to Asians. No, no, there's only one electric company. But if I'm a restaurant, if I'm a hotel, if I'm an airline, for heaven's sake, I should have the right to say, yes, we will serve this sort of people. Now, you will argue, oh my gosh, then no black people will ever be served anywhere. That's not true at all. People will want to make money by serving certain sectors of the population. That's the great thing about capitalism. In the United States, we had what were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were passed that forbid people in the South to hire blacks as masons or carpenters or bricklayers. They had to pass those laws because if blacks were capable and competent bricklayers and masons, white people would hire them. And so it will be a balancing act between the forces of the free market, at least when it comes to public accommodation and who will be served and who will be employed, and the preferences of individuals. But yes, we absolutely need freedom of association for good reasons, bad reasons, or no reasons at all. And many people, as I said before, already, when it comes to where they live, when it comes to where they send their children to school, white people very clearly express a preference for people like themselves. They would never admit it. But for most whites, even the most ferocious liberals, if you were to ask them, well, could you name a majority non-white neighborhood you'd like to live in? They'll be stumped. They'll be absolutely stumped. And some of the most raving liberals in Congress, for example, they live in lily white neighborhoods. This is one of the accepted hypocrisies of American society, and no one is ever punished for failing to live up to the kinds of admiration for diversity that they are constantly promoting in public.
So, what do you make of the Trump administration, the agenda it has around immigration, border enforcement, mass deportations, and the current developments with the LA riots as well? Is Trump doing enough to save America, in your opinion?
Well, Donald Trump is a very curious character. He does not, in my view, have a real racial consciousness. I don't think he thinks in terms of the long-term demographic future of the United States. I don't think he realizes that if he really wanted to make America great again, he'd have to make America white again. I realize that may sound like a radical statement, but to rebuild the America of his youth, that is to say, an America that was worked together, that had a sense of united destiny, that was strong. That was an overwhelmingly white America. It was not one that was distracted by all of these constant racial conflicts. That is an America that would be great in my mind. I don't think he understands that. Now, at the same time, the measures that he is taking are precisely the ones that a racially conscious white American president would take. Ending immigration, expelling all illegal immigrants to the extent possible, getting rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of these racial preference programs that have been shoved into every single corner of the American government, getting rid of all of this by fiat, by executive order. All of this is a very, very good thing. What he in effect is doing is slowing down the dispossession of whites. 90% of the people who come to this country as immigrants, legally or illegally, are non-white. And so if you end that, then this process of reducing whites to a minority declines. And all of these racial preferences that have been built into every aspect of the American government and even in the private sector, getting rid of all of that. And finally, getting the Supreme Court to recognize, as just happened a few weeks ago, that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned private racial discrimination, yes, it applies, believe it or not, equally to discrimination against people in the majority. All of this is a great change over previous administrations. A Harris administration would have continued to force all of this onto us in just the most relentless way. So all of this is 100% a good thing. Now, so in terms of his domestic, racially oriented report card, I would give him an A plus. I have a completely different view of his foreign policy with tariffs, what he's been proposing about perhaps absorbing Greenland or making Canada the 51st state. All of this, I think, is verging on insane. He's going to turn Gaza into the Riviera. This stuff is cuckoo. But in terms of what he's done, as far as immigration is concerned and race relations in the United States, it's 100% good. You asked about the riots in Los Angeles. This is a very important and significant thing. You have our immigration authorities going in to Los Angeles and arresting people who are in the country illegally, which is their right to do. The law requires them to do this, and trying to expel them. And then you have people violently, in some cases, opposing this. Well, what's the thinking here? The thinking is crystal clear when not only do they start burning the automobiles of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, what's known as ICE, they start burning these vehicles, but they're waving Mexican flags while they're at it. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that they're waving Mexican flags. That shows you where their loyalty lies. At the same time, there is a strange irony here. They are waving the flags of the countries to which they refuse to be deported. What does this mean? What does this mean? Clearly, The idea is they have a right to live in the United States, come and go entirely as they please. Their loyalties are strictly to Mexico or to some other foreign country, and they are going to burn the vehicles, the people who are enforcing immigration law in the United States. This is, I think, a wonderful, eye-opening message to many Americans who are fine when ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, deports illegal immigrants who are criminals, but people get a little bit more hesitant when it turns out, well, maybe they're here legally, but they have jobs, they haven't committed crimes. No, they've all got to go. Sorry. And the fact that you can't get these people to go without provoking what borders on a kind of race-related insurrection of people who wave foreign flags, this is, I think, a very compelling lesson to those Americans who think, well, so long as they haven't committed violent crimes, well, then maybe they should stay. Well, no, this shows you what their mentality is and who is opposing the enforcement of currently enacted immigration law. So I think this was inevitable. I'm a little bit surprised that resistance to these raids has not happened until now. But one of the differences compared to earlier raids is that this is taking place in what's called a sanctuary state. Some of the states in the United States, some of the cities in the United States are called sanctuaries, and the local law enforcement people refuse to cooperate with the federal authorities whose job it is to find and deport illegal immigrants. There's some debate as to whether or not they have the right to refuse to cooperate with enforcement of federal law. Be that as it may. Under these circumstances, then the federal government will say, okay, we've got no cooperation for these people. That's why we have to come in with a National Guard and make sure things work. But all of this brings to a head a completely different view of the United States. Should the United States be a place that's essentially up for grabs? Doesn't matter if you're here illegally. If you're here illegally, and so long as you're not raping or murdering or mugging, then okay, who cares where you're from? Who cares how many show up? That has been traditionally the Democratic view. Or is the United States a nation that was built by a particular people who have the right to preserve their majority status and to maintain a nation with a distinct set of values created by a distinct set of people? So to the extent that these differences in view come into higher relief, the differences become more visible to more people. It's all for the good. I don't like riots. I don't like violence. But the net effect of this is to open people's eyes to the contending world views. And I believe that they are contending in such a spectacular way that my worldview, namely that of a coherent, culturally and racially coherent United States, has a legitimacy. That worldview is served by the current disturbances in Los Angeles.
Now, do you have one final piece of advice for young people who perhaps are interested in your ideas, who are beginning a journey that you went on? Do you have advice from experience that you have gained, things that you wished you knew at the beginning?
I suppose one thing I would say is that the fight to preserve nations in which whites are a majority and which they can be guaranteed of a perpetual majority. This is going to be a very long one. And it's one that you should not necessarily jump into with both feet as soon as you realize what is at stake. For those of you who are considering trying to be on the side of the movement of those who wish to preserve European civilization, it's good to get an education. It's good to establish yourself professionally. This is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next month or next year. It is good for you to establish yourself professionally. It's also good to have a family. One of the most important things that white people can do is have white children. There is no white country in the world that has a fertility rate that is sufficient to replace the number of white people. And if we all just die out from natural causes, then our attempts to build white homelands are going to be pointless, aren't they? If there aren't enough white people even to live in them. So it's all very well to develop a kind of passion and enthusiasm for the things that I'm talking about. That's great. But don't let that distract you or divert you from establishing yourself with a family, with a profession, and think very carefully about whether or not you can be openly associated with white advocacy or whether it's best to help from the sidelines. It may be best for you to give money to people who are involved in this professionally. It may be better for you to provide services of some kind. Or if your circumstances permit, then go ahead and be active. Run for office. I think in the United States, the times are ripe for a carefully packaged and reasonable white advocate to be elected to city council, to state legislature, to mayor, to sheriff. All of these things are increasingly possible. But don't leap into this with the sudden passion of the new convert, because you may end up burning bridges and doing things you may later regret. That would be my advice.
Well, thank you very much. And to the audience and listeners, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Jared Taylor, American author and editor of American Renaissance.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.